The winter air was a jagged blade that sliced through the ancient pines, carrying the scent of impending frost and forgotten silence. Arthur, a man in his late 70s with a beard as white as the drifts piling against his porch, lived a life of profound isolation in a small cabin nestled deep within the mountain pass. Since the passing of his wife years ago, his world had shrunk to the size of a wood-burning stove and the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to measure the weight of his loneliness. He was a man who had intentionally retreated from a world that moved too fast, finding a bitter comfort in the harsh, unforgiving landscape. His hands, gnarled like the roots of an old oak, spent their days chopping wood and mending nets, while his heart remained locked in a cold, internal winter. He believed he was simply waiting for his own time to fade into the white horizon, unaware that the universe was about to send him a reason to fight for one more breath. One evening, as a ferocious blizzard began to howl like a chorus of ghosts, Arthur heard a faint, desperate scratching at his heavy oak door. It was a sound so thin it almost vanished beneath the roar of the wind, but something in its persistence made him reach for the iron latch. When the door swung open, a cloud of snow swirled into the room, and at his feet lay a creature that looked more like a heap of frozen shadow than a living being. It was a large stray dog, its fur matted with ice and blood from a deep gash on its flank, its breathing so shallow it barely stirred the air. Most would have seen a dying animal, but Arthur saw a reflection of his own battered spirit. Despite his dwindling supplies and the ache in his bones, he knelt in the freezing draft, gathered the trembling creature into his arms, and brought him toward the dying embers of the hearth, beginning a vigil that would last through the longest night of his life. For 3 days and nights, Arthur tended to the dog he named Bear, using his last scraps of dried meat and his precious store of medicinal herbs to combat the fever and the infection. He stayed awake by the fire, whispering stories of his youth to the unconscious animal, his own voice sounding foreign to his ears after months of silence. He bandaged the wound with strips of an old flannel shirt and fed the dog warm broth drop by drop, sacrificing his own comfort to ensure the animal's survival. There was no logic in his actions. He was a man with very little to give, yet he gave everything to a stranger that could offer nothing but a faint wag of a tail. As Bear's amber eyes finally fluttered open and focused on Arthur with a look of profound, soulful gratitude, the ice around the old man's heart began to crack. He realized that in his attempt to save a life, he had accidentally started to save his own from the crushing weight of apathy. As the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world draped in a deceptive, sparkling silence, Bear regained his strength with miraculous speed, his presence filling the cabin with a warmth that wood and fire could never provide. He followed Arthur everywhere, a silent, furry sentinel who watched the old man with an intensity that suggested he understood the magnitude of the debt he owed. However, the mountain was a fickle master, and the heavy accumulation of snow had made the terrain around the cabin treacherous. One afternoon, while Arthur was attempting to clear a path to the woodpile, a massive shelf of snow on the ridge above gave way. The sound was a low, guttural roar as the white wall cascaded down, catching Arthur off guard and pinning his lower body beneath a heavy timber and a mound of freezing debris. He was trapped, invisible from the trail, and the cold was already beginning to numb his senses as the sun dipped below the peaks. Arthur shouted until his voice was a mere rasp, but the vast wilderness swallowed his cries without an echo. He felt the darkness closing in, a familiar sleepiness that promised an end to the pain, and he prepared himself for the inevitable. But Bear refused to let the silence win. The dog scrambled through the deep snow, his powerful lungs heaving as he dug frantically at the spot where Arthur was buried. When he realized he couldn't move the heavy timber alone, Bear didn't give up. Instead of staying to mourn, he turned and sprinted toward the distant mountain trail, his instincts guiding him toward the only hope of survival. He ran for miles through the biting cold, his paws bleeding against the crusty ice, until he encountered a group of winter hikers. He barked with a ferocity that demanded attention, nipping at their sleeves and leading them back through the labyrinth of trees toward the cabin, his eyes pleading with a human-like desperation that they couldn't ignore. The hikers found Arthur just as the first stars began to pierce the indigo sky, his pulse a faint, irregular beat against the cold. They worked together to lift the timber and drag him into the warmth of the cabin, where Bear immediately curled his warm body around the old man's frozen limbs. It was a miracle of timing and animal intelligence that left the rescuers in awe. They were part of a documentary film crew exploring the mountain, and they captured the entire scene on their cameras, the loyalty of the dog and the fragile bond between two survivors. As Arthur regained consciousness and felt the rhythmic thump of Bear's tail against his side, he knew that the roles of savior and saved had been reversed. He had given the dog a few days of warmth, and in return, the dog had given him back his life and a future he had long ago abandoned. The story of the Hermit and the Bear spread far beyond the mountain pass after the film crew shared their footage with the world. Arthur became an overnight symbol of the enduring power of compassion, and the isolation he once sought was replaced by a community of people moved by his kindness. He received thousands of letters and donations, allowing him to renovate his cabin and establish a sanctuary for stray and injured animals in the valley. He was no longer a ghost waiting for the end. He was a man with a mission, surrounded by the wagging tails and grateful eyes of those he continued to rescue. Bear remained his constant companion, the lead protector of the sanctuary, and the two were never seen apart. Arthur's hands were still gnarled, and his beard was still white, but the winter in his heart had been replaced by a permanent, blossoming spring, fueled by the memory of a scratching at the door. In the final years of his life, Arthur sat on his new porch, watching Bear play in the meadow with a litter of rescued pups. The mountain was still beautiful and harsh, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a home. He realized that the greatest treasure he ever found wasn't buried in the earth, but was found in the wet nose and loyal heart of a dog that everyone else had given up on. He had learned that kindness is a currency that always returns with interest, and that no one is ever too old or too broken to make a difference. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the sanctuary, Arthur reached down to scratch Bear behind the ears, a silent thank you that the dog answered with a soft, contented sigh. They were two survivors who had found each other in the storm, proving that even in the coldest winter, love is the only fire that can never be extinguished.